Right. As this video plays, pause whenever you need to take notes, or if you're the teacher, pause so that students can take notes. Anything that is underlined is considered notes. And so the very first thing you need to know when you're studying the introductory part of psychology is the definition of psychology. Psychology is the study of behavior that is tested through scientific research. Oftentimes this is everyday behavior. A lot of times when people think of psychology, they jump right away to psychological disorders, things that may be considered abnormal behavior. But psychologists don't study just the abnormal things. They study typical everyday behaviors as well. So psychology has 4 goals. I apologize, I think most of the things on here might be underlined. Oh no, not so much. Okay, so the first goal of psychology is description. Description would be how a scientist or psychologist gathers information to describe the studied behavior. Secondly, you have explanation. Explanation would be the psychological principles. The psychologist uses these generally valid ideas about behavior to form hypotheses, and after researching the hypotheses and finding more complex explanations, they actually form theories. So what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis would be like an educated guess about some phenomenon that is tested through scientific research. It's the idea that you have a good idea of what is going on, but you're not completely sure. So you make this educated guess, you're coming up with a possible conclusion, and then you test it to see if it actually is right. A theory is more of the conclusion you get from this process. A theory is a set of assumptions used to explain phenomena and offered for scientific study. So you start off at the beginning with a hypothesis, by the end you come up with another explanation called a theory. As I said before, pause is necessary, but I will continue on to the next slide. The third is prediction. Prediction is when a psychologist uses accumulated knowledge and what organisms will do, think, or feel in various situations. Studying past behaviors is a good way to predict future behaviors. The next one is influence. Some psychologists seeking long-term goals want to influence behaviors in helpful ways. They use what is called basic science or research for this. Others, though, see psychology as an applied science, and they use principles in solving more immediate issues. They use what we already know about people to benefit others. So basic science is really just researching for the sake of research, whereas applied science is taking what's already known and using it to benefit others. So here are your definitions. Once again, basic science, pursuit of knowledge about natural phenomena for its own sake, and applied science, discovering ways to use scientific findings to accomplish practical goals. So many people wonder, why is it a good idea to study psychology? Well, the first thing is to gain insight into behavior. Why do you and I, why do other organisms, why do other animals feel the way that we all do in different situations? Why do we behave the way we do? How do our physiological, which is kind of like your body's like chemical functions, and cognitive needs affect our behaviors? Cognitive, that's more in your brain. So physiological, having to do with an organism's physical processes, and cognitive, having to do with an organism's thinking and understanding. So both physiological and cognitive processes actually influence behavior. Oops. Forgot to warn you that I'm going to the next slide. So if you need to pause, go ahead. Okay, there are no notes on this, so I'm not sure why origins is underlined. But the origins of psychology come from the origins of science itself. By the time the 5th and 6th centuries BC came around, Greek philosophers relied on human perceptions and observations to interpret the world, and people were looking for something more scientific than just common sense to explain these things. So this set the stage for developing the sciences. This includes psychology and other behavioral sciences. During the Renaissance, which happened in the 16th and 17th centuries, People like Copernicus, Galileo, and other individuals used observation more and more in experiments. They often faced social ramifications for this, but because they were willing to do this observation, to conduct these experiments, we were able to develop future sciences. Everything underlined, once again, is notes here. I'll go back. Go ahead and pause if you need to. And now, once again, if it's underlined, it's notes. Historical approaches. Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt, if you want to pronounce it the proper German way, created structuralism. Within structuralism, he came up with the idea of introspection. That is a method of self-observation in which participants report their thoughts and feelings. Even though this is part of structuralism, this is something that kind of influences free association when we talk about psychoanalytic theory. William James is considered the father of psychology, and he created a psychological perspective called functionalism. So this approach is different than what Wundt was doing. Okay, take a pause here if you need to. Sir Francis Galton sparked the nature versus nurture debate that still exists. Nature is related to heredity, nurture is related to the surroundings or environment. A person, animal, creature, anything that has something that you can study in psychology are raised in. Okay, you have Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kafka as a group of German psychologists who argued that perception is more than the sum of its parts and involves a whole pattern. This whole pattern in German is called a Gestalt. So they developed Gestalt psychology. They studied how sensations are assembled into perceptual experiences. This approach would lead to cognitive approaches. When we talk about Gestalt psychology, this actually relates to a unit that comes later on in the semester called Sensation and Perception. Going to continue on to the next slide. Our contemporary approaches. The one that is very well known, even if it's not practiced in and of itself, it might be part of more of an eclectic approach to some practices among therapists, but a very well-known one is the psychoanalytic theory, or Freud's theory of psychology. The focus is on the unconscious mind. That includes primitive biological urges, and oftentimes those conflict with morals in society. He said that these urges control most behavior, and that's why oftentimes people have unexplainable medical symptoms. People who follow this approach are called psychoanalysts. Freud, some of his ideas are brilliant and some are really out there, and I would suggest looking up Freud in particular, just to understand what I'm talking about. I will give you more details when I'm in class sometime. I mentioned free association before, and I think this is something that comes out of introspection, honestly. That is a technique in which the patient says everything that comes to mind, and he ended up extending it to dream analysis. Right, I'm going to switch slides here. Pavlov is one of the first behaviorists, or someone who studies behavioral psychology. In a famous experiment, Pavlov would ring, I have tuning fork here, but historically speaking, it could have been some other thing, like a bell that made a noise though. But we'll say tuning fork, that's how the story goes. But he would ring a tuning fork every time he gave dogs meat powder. The dogs would salivate when offered the meat powder, and soon did so only at the sound of the tuning fork. He trained them to do that through his behavioral approach. And we'll talk about, when we get to our unit on learning, how that is something that continued to influence other behaviorists. These are the psychologists, though, who believe in studying observable behavior. Watson is another very famous one. I'm trying to think who else. But Watson was really the next guy after Pavlov who did this. They thought that psychology could only be concerned with the observable facts of behavior. Right, moving on to the next slide. Humanistic psychology is something that Maslow, Rogers, and May all studied. Maslow and Rogers were partners with each other, and you may have heard um, of some of their theory before in other classes. These kind of psychologists are called humanists, and the idea is that human nature is evolving and self-directed, and each person directs his or her future and personal growth. Next group we have are cognitive psychologists. The most famous out of these is probably Piaget, but you've possibly heard the other ones, Chomsky and Festinger, in other classes as well. They're called, and I cannot say this word properly, but cognitivists. Cognitivists. There we go. Cognitivists. The focus there is on how we process, store, retrieve, and use information, and how cognitive processes influence behavior. We're not really going to get into biological psychology at all, but the people who study that are called psychobiologists. The focus is on how the brain, the nervous system, hormones, genetics influence behavior, and this relates more to human physiology as opposed to the previous group who's looking more at cognitive processes. And finally, we have sociocultural psychology. The focus is on how culture and society influence psychology. I'm going to change slides here. This would be a good time to pause. Okay, problems and solutions research. Once again, only the underlined info is considered notes. I'm moving on to the next slide. Okay, vocabulary to term. Self-fulfilling prophecy. That is a situation in which a researcher's expectations influence that person's own behavior and thereby influences the participant's behavior. More details to come. A single-blind experiment. An experiment in which the participants are unaware of which participants received the treatment. Once again, more explanation to come. Take a pause here if you need it. Okay, double-blind experiment. An experiment in which neither the experimenter nor the participants know which participants received which treatment. I'm not going to watch the video. Placebo effect. That is a change in a participant's illness or behavior that results from a belief that the treatment will have an effect rather than the actual treatment. Pause if you need to before I change the slide. Self-fulfilling prophecy. We pick up on each other's intentional and unintentional cues daily and then act as others expect us to act. To avoid self-fulfilling prophecy, though, in experiments, psychologists must take measures to avoid these cues. The best way to do that is to do a double-blind experiment instead of a simple blind experiment. So the best way to avoid causing a self-fulfilling prophecy may be using a double-blind experiment technique. That way, the person doing the experiment doesn't know who's getting the treatment and who isn't. This is a good time to pause. Moving on. The placebo effect. Experimenters must take this into account when testing the effects of drugs on patients. Even in some experiments with just placebos, patients felt the effects of the supposed drugs. Once again, you want to pause here so people can take note. This is a cartoon that I found, and it shows where I got the cartoon. And basically, this is just a joke saying that this is a placebo line. It serves no purpose, but it makes us feel good. When in actuality, placebos do serve a purpose. They are a control in the experiment. The Milgram effect, or experiment, excuse me. In the 1960s, Milgram had several male volunteers participate in an experiment. They thought they were being told to shock learners who failed to memorize prepared words. The learners pretended to be in pain when the supposed shock level increased up to 450 volts. More than half of the participants went all the way up to 450 volt shock. And because of that, many questioned the ethics of the experiment and the effects on the participants. Keep in mind, no one was actually shocked, but the effects of the fact that some people would go to that point, that was something that they were worried about, the ethical ramifications for the people involved in the experiment who didn't realize they weren't shocking anyone at all. I'm almost out of time, but here's a diagram that kind of explains how it works. And so S is the person in the other room. he's not really hooked up to the shock. But V tells L to shock him. The end.